The sterile hum of the NSA Georgia SCIF was a lullaby of data streams and filtered air. Petty Officer First Class Chloe Bennett's world was a 24-inch monitor, a headset, and the endless river of encrypted signals flowing from a conflict zone half a world away. Her fingers, adorned with a simple silver band, danced across the keyboard with practiced ease, a conductor orchestrating silence from chaos. It was routine, monotonous, until it wasn't. A single, frantic alert chirped, a stark red icon flashing in the corner of her screen. It was a ghost, a signal with a modulation pattern that shouldn't exist. Her heart, a steady drum a moment before, skipped a beat. She isolated the frequency, her brow furrowing. The encryption was familiar, a ghost from a life she'd buried. Her superior, Chief Wallace, leaned over her station, his coffee breath a familiar scent. Another glitch, Bennett? Atmospheric interference. Junk data. Log it and move on. But Chloe couldn't move on. The signal's digital fingerprint was etched into her memory, a painful scar. She waited until her shift ended, until the SCIF was empty save for the hum of the servers. The night crew nodded as she passed, assuming she was pulling a double. She found an isolated terminal in a dimly lit bay, the glow of the screen the only light on her face. From a pocket, she retrieved a small, unmarked encrypted drive, a relic she'd sworn never to use again. Her hand trembled slightly as she inserted it. The bypass software was old, but it was hers, a tool from another life. Lines of code scrolled, a language only she and a handful of ghosts still spoke. The signal resolved, the layers of encryption falling away like petals. It wasn't a message. It was a scream. A code phrase materialized on the screen, stark white against black. Nightingale is compromised. The blood drained from her face. She knew that name. It was a CIA cryptonym, a deep cover asset. And someone, using a protocol that belonged in a grave, was screaming that she was betrayed. This wasn't a glitch. It was a catastrophe waiting to happen. And she was the only one who could hear the warning. The secure video teleconference screen split her world in two. On one side, the cool, sterile dimness of the NSA SCIF. On the other, a grainy feed from a dusty, makeshift command post. Mark Ronson, his face etched with the fatigue of 100 sleepless nights and a cynical squint, filled the screen. He listened to her briefing with the impatient air of a man hearing a fairy tale. "Let me get this straight, Petty Officer," Ronson interrupted, his voice a dry rasp. "You're telling me you found a needle in a haystack. A needle that, according to your own analysis, doesn't exist." He leaned closer to his camera, his image pixelating slightly. "I've got assets on the ground. My people are telling me the box is quiet. That frequency, that hop pattern, only a few tier 1 Black Ops units in the world use that signal. And none are active in that box. You're chasing ghosts. Probably some local warlord with a malfunctioning radio." Chloe's knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of her desk. She could feel the chief's eyes on her back from across the room. She kept her voice level professional, though every instinct screamed at her to make him understand. "With respect, sir, the modulation is a derivative of the Starlight Protocol. It's not a standard unit identifier. My analysis suggests it's a distress call." Ronson scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The Starlight Protocol? That's a myth. A story old-timers tell new guys over beers. Even if it was real, it's been deprecated for years. You're reading a screen. I'm reading the ground. The answer is no. I'm not scrambling assets and risking lives on a SIGINT anomaly." He reached forward, his hand hovering to terminate the call. The dismissal was a physical blow. It was the same arrogance, the same institutional blindness that had cost lives before. She couldn't let it happen again. Not this time. The words were out of her mouth before her brain could stop them, her voice dropping to a low, urgent register that cut through the static of the line. "The counter signal," she said, her eyes locking onto his through the screen. the one that authenticates a friendly in duress. It's not in the modulation. It's a 3-millisecond delay on the second frequency hop. She didn't wait for his permission. Her fingers flew across her secondary keyboard, pulling up a sound file. She isolated the rogue transmission, focused on the precise moment, and replayed it with the exact, microscopic delay she had described. A new, subtly different tone emerged from the chaos. A tone of pure, undeniable panic. She let the sound hang in the air between them, a digital ghost given voice. The change on the screen was instantaneous. Ronson's hand froze midair. All the cynicism drained from his face, replaced by a stunned, pale shock. The junior analyst behind him in the tent stopped fidgeting and stared, his mouth slightly agape. The line was silent for 5 full seconds, the hum of the satellites their only company. Ronson slowly leaned back into his chair, his eyes wide, looking at her not as a sailor, but as something else entirely. Something impossible. "Who the hell are you?" he whispered, the words barely audible. The silence in the SCIF was absolute, heavier than any sound. Mark Ronson's question hung in the air, a challenge and an accusation all at once. Chloe could feel the weight of her chief's stare from across the room, a mix of confusion and dawning suspicion. She had crossed a line there was no coming back from. The carefully constructed wall between her past and present had just been obliterated by 3 milliseconds of audio. Ronson's image on the screen was frozen, his fingers still hovering over the disconnect button. The casual arrogance was gone, replaced by a razor-sharp focus she recognized instantly. It was the look of a predator who had just discovered a much more dangerous one in its territory. "Run that again," he commanded, his voice low and stripped of all its prior dismissiveness. She complied, her movements mechanical. The distorted signal filled the quiet room once more, followed by the clean, precise echo she had created. The difference was undeniable, a secret handshake revealed. "Now explain it," Ronson said, his eyes boring into hers through the video link. "In detail. And don't leave anything out." This was it, the moment she had dreaded for years. She took a shallow breath, the familiar scent of ozone and fear filling her senses. "The protocol was called Starlight," she began, her voice surprisingly steady. "It was designed for deep cover operatives who couldn't use standard authentication. The delay wasn't a flaw. It was the key. Only the sender and the intended receiver would know the exact millisecond to listen for it. Anyone else would just hear garbage." She could see the calculations going on behind his eyes. He was accessing mental files, cross-referencing whispers and legends from the darkest corners of their world. That program was shuttered. The people who knew it, they didn't walk away. A faint, bitter smile touched her lips. Most of them didn't. Her hand instinctively went to the silver chain around her neck, her fingers finding the cool, familiar shape of the dog tags hidden beneath her uniform. She saw his gaze drop, noting the gesture, filing it away. "Who are you?" he asked again, the question softer now, but no less intense. It was no longer a demand for her name and rank. It was a question about the ghost he was now speaking to. The word felt foreign on her tongue, a name from a ghost story. "My call sign was Sphinx." The reaction was immediate. A barely perceptible flinch, a sharp intake of breath from the analyst behind him. Ronson's face went utterly still. He knew the name. Everyone in that particular circle knew the name and the tragedy attached to it. The entire team lost on a black op in Iraq. Wiped out. No survivors. Except one. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions, and the echoes of a disaster everyone thought was buried. He was no longer looking at a petty officer. He was looking at a monument to a failure he'd only read about in classified postmortems. And she had just told him that monument was screaming a warning he could no longer afford to ignore. The silence that followed her admission was a living thing, thick and heavy in the sterile air. Mark Ronson's face on the screen had transformed from shock to a grim, calculating stillness. The legend of Sphinx and the decimation of her ISA team was a cautionary tale whispered in the darkest corners of the intelligence community. A story of a betrayal so complete it had ended an entire program. And now its sole survivor was telling him his own operation was compromised. Nightingale, Ronson said, the name a gravelly whisper. The cynicism was gone, burned away by the cold reality of her revelation. He turned, barking an order to someone off-screen. Get me a direct line to the director. Now. Scrambled the alert. He turned back to Chloe, his eyes sharp. You're sure about the compromised signal? I'm sure, Chloe said, her voice flat. The emotional dam had broken, leaving behind a cold, professional clarity. She was Sphinx again, if only for this moment. The syntax is exact. It's not a drill. It's a panic button. Ronson gave a curt nod, accepting her authority on this single, terrifying point. All right, Sphinx. You have the floor. Talk to me. The use of her old call sign was a deliberate choice, an acknowledgement that the rulebook had been thrown out the window. The dynamic had shifted utterly. The dismissive case officer was gone, replaced by a man suddenly aware he was in over his head. Chloe's hands flew across the keyboard, pulling up satellite imagery, signal strength maps, and topographic overlays. The signal originated here, she said, highlighting a grid square in the mountainous region. But it's a relay, a bounce. The source is here. Another marker appeared 50 miles away, in a densely packed urban center. They're moving her, probably to a more secure location for interrogation. You have a small window. Interrogation means she's still alive, Ronson muttered, more to himself than to her. He ran a hand over his face. My team is 6 hours out. We'll never make it in time. You don't have to, Chloe said, her focus absolute. She was deep in the zone, the world narrowing to the data on her screens. The signal is still active. It's faint, but it's there. A low-power burst transmitter, probably sewn into her clothing. They haven't found it yet. I can track it. I can guide you in. She could see the conflict on his face. Trusting a ghost, bypassing every protocol, on the word of a sailor who had just confessed to being a walking, classified secret. The risk was astronomical. The cost of being wrong, unthinkable. He stared at her through the screen, his gaze searching for any hint of doubt. He found none, only the cold, hard certainty of someone who had seen this nightmare before. Do it, he said, the words final. You're on the clock, Sphinx. Don't let her die. The line went dead, leaving Chloe alone with the ghost of her past and the faint, fading heartbeat of a signal she alone could hear. The mission was on. The connection died, leaving behind a profound silence broken only by the hum of servers. Chloe didn't move. Ronson's final command, don't let her die, echoed in the void, a weight settling on her shoulders she hadn't felt in years. She was back in. The calm, analytical part of her mind, the part that had been Sphinx, took over, shoving the rising tide of panic into a locked box. She had a job to do. Her fingers became a blur across the keyboard, pulling up programs and interfaces she hadn't accessed since her days at Fort Belvoir. She established a dedicated, encrypted channel directly to Ronson's field team, bypassing the entire NSA infrastructure. She was operating in the shadows now, a ghost guiding ghosts. A new window bloomed on her main screen, a live drone feed from the operational area. The world outside her SCF vanished, replaced by a grainy, green-hued view of a sleeping city from 10,000 feet. A crisp, professional voice crackled in her headset. Watchtower, this is Talon Actual. We are feet dry and approaching the urban area. Do you have a fix on the package? The voice was calm, steady. It was the voice of a man who trusted his intel. Chloe felt a sharp pang of guilt. He didn't know his intel was a ghost. Talon Actual, this is Watchtower, she said, her voice adopting the cool, dispassionate tone of a mission controller. I have the signal. It's weak, but stable. Transmitting coordinates now. The package is mobile, moving in a commercial vehicle, a white panel van, heading east on the main arterial. She watched the blip on her tracking screen, a tiny digital heart beating in the darkness. She guided them, her words a steady stream of data. Turn north at the next intersection. They're 2 blocks ahead of you. Slow your approach. Traffic is condensing. She was their eyes, seeing the city through a mosaic of satellite imagery and signal-strength triangulation. She navigated them through narrow side streets, avoiding military checkpoints she could see forming on the drone feed. It was a deadly dance, and she was the choreographer. The tension was a wire pull taut. Every stoplight, every pedestrian that forced the van to slow was a gift. Every second that passed was a second closer to the agent's location being discovered. Then the signal flickered. A sudden, alarming dip in strength. Chloe's blood ran cold. Talon actual, be advised. Signal degradation. Significant drop in power. The team lead's voice tightened. Interpretation, watchtower. The unspoken question hung in the air. Was the battery dying? Or was the transmitter being found? Before she could answer, her secondary monitor, dedicated to monitoring background signals, flashed a new alert. It was a different kind of signal, a sophisticated, encrypted data stream she'd been trained to recognize. It wasn't coming from the van. It was pinging off a server halfway across the world, a server with A.mil designation. The betrayal wasn't just in the field. It was inside the house. The wire snapped. Talon actual, abort. Abort the mission. The words tore from her throat, raw with a fear she knew all too well. The signal is compromised. It's a trap. They're not just moving her, they're tracking you. The silence that followed her warning was more terrifying than any sound. For 3 agonizing heartbeats, the only thing in her headset was the faint hum of the open channel. Then, chaos erupted. A voice, not Talon actual's, shouted a raw, guttural warning in another language. The screech of tires tearing against asphalt ripped through the audio feed. The drone feed on her screen, which had been a peaceful, green-hued view of a city street, suddenly erupted into a strobing nightmare of muzzle flashes from rooftops and windows. The white panel van they were following slammed on its brakes, its doors flying open to disgorge armed men, not a captive. It was a perfect, brutal ambush. Contact front. Contact right. They're everywhere. Talon actual's voice was now a controlled yell, punctuated by the sharp, percussive cracks of rifle fire. The audio was a jarring mix of professional callouts and the raw sounds of a fight for survival. Watchtower, we are pinned down. We are taking heavy fire from elevated positions. They knew we were coming. Chloe's world shrank to the chaos on the screen and in her ears. She was trapped in her chair, thousands of miles away, utterly powerless. The feeling was a physical pain, a devastating echo of the past. She could only listen, her stomach churning, as the team fought for their lives. She heard the desperate radio calls, the grunts of exertion, the shouted coordinates for covering fire. It was all happening exactly as it had before. The same script, different actors, same tragic ending. She had led them right into it. Her knowledge, her unique skill, had been the weapon used against them. A massive explosion rocked the audio feed, static washing over the channel for a terrifying moment. When it cleared, the sound of gunfire was more sporadic. Fewer voices called out. Talon actual's breathing was ragged, strained. Watchtower, we have multiple casualties. We cannot hold this position. They're flanking us. The transmission cut in and out. Total comms blackout, jammers are active. The signal dissolved into a wash of digital noise, then into the most horrifying sound of all, dead air. The steady hum of the open line was gone. They had been severed, isolated, and left to die. Chloe sat frozen in the silence of the SCIF. The only sound was her own ragged breathing. The screens in front of her showed a frozen drone image of a smoky street, the signal tracker a flat, hopeless line. She had failed. Again. The ghosts of her old team seemed to crowd the room, their silent accusations a heavier burden than any command. She had tried to outrun her past, but it had found her, and it had brought death with it. She was just a sailor at a desk, listening to the world end through a headset, completely and utterly alone. The weight of it crushed her, pressing her down into the chair. There was nothing left to do. The mission was over. The silence was a tomb. It pressed in on her, suffocating and absolute. On the screen, the drone feed showed nothing but swirling dust and stationary shadows. In her headset, the dead air was a roar of failure. They were gone. Because of her. The grief was a physical blow, a sharp, hot pain in her chest. She had been so arrogant, so sure that stepping back into her old skin would be enough. She had forgotten the cost. She had forgotten the blood that always soaked the shadows of that world. Her eyes fell on the silver chain around her neck. Without thinking, her fingers found the cool metal of the dog tags, tracing the stamped letters of a name that should never have been etched there. Sergeant Miller, her team leader, her friend, the man who had died because of a compromised signal, a betrayed signal. The parallel was a knife twisting in the wound. History wasn't repeating itself, it was taunting her. A cold, hard fury began to burn through the numbness. This wasn't just a mission failure. It was a personal violation. Someone had used her own history, her own pain, as a weapon. They had taken the sacred protocol of her fallen team and turned it into a trap. They had desecrated the memory of every person on that rage ignited in her chest, hot and clean and blinding. No, this would not stand. They would not get away with using her ghosts to create new ones. Her hands, which had been trembling with shock, became steady. The grief was shoved into a deep, locked compartment. Sphinx didn't grieve in the field. Sphinx acted. She looked at the blank screens, the dead channels. They had been cut off, isolated. Standard protocol. The enemy owned the local battle space. But they didn't own the sky. She began to type, her movements swift and precise, driven by a furious, focused energy. She bypassed layers of security, accessing satellite control systems she had no right to even know existed. She was no longer Petty Officer Chloe Bennett. She was a force of nature, a ghost reaching out from the grave to claw back at the living. She targeted a communications satellite, its footprint covering half the continent. She didn't try to send a message. She sent a scream. She configured the transmission, pouring every ounce of her anger and grief into the code. She set it to broadcast on every frequency, military, civilian, everything. It was a siren call of pure digital distress. And at its heart, she embedded the one thing she knew would be heard. The original uncorrupted Starlight distress call. The one she had replicated for Ronson. The one that belonged to her and her team. She added a data burst, the coordinates of the ambush, the identity of the trap team. She was shining the biggest, brightest spotlight imaginable on the darkest secret in the city. Her finger hovered over the enter key. This was it. There was no coming back from this. She would be court-martialed, imprisoned, erased. She took one last breath, seeing the faces of her team, hearing the silenced pleas of Talon Actual. It was a price she was willing to pay. She slammed her finger down. Answer the call. She whispered into the void, a prayer and a challenge. Someone please answer the call. The signal launched into the ether, a desperate, roaring flame in the darkness. The silence that followed the transmission was the longest of her life. Each second stretched into an eternity, filled with the pounding of her own heart. She had just committed a career-ending, possibly life-ending, act. She had lit a beacon that every intelligence agency on the planet would be scrambling to trace. She stared at the screen, waiting for the inevitable, for her terminal to lock down, for security forces to storm the SCIF. But the screen didn't lock. Instead, a new signal pierced the static. It was weak at first, then stronger, cutting through the jamming with brutal clarity. A new voice, calm, professional, and utterly authoritative, filled her headset. All stations, this is Viking Actual. We have your starlight. Authenticate Bravo Charlie 79er. It was a JSOC authentication code. A code she knew. A wild, disbelieving hope flared in her chest. She fumbled for her microphone, her voice rough with emotion. Viking Actual, this is Watchtower. Authenticating. 79er confirmed. We have friendly forces pinned down at these coordinates. They are under heavy assault and have casualties. Coordinates received, Watchtower. We are inbound. Stand by for thunder. The line went live with a new kind of chaos. Not the desperate sounds of an ambush, but the controlled, terrifying symphony of a professional counter-assault. Over the comms, she heard the distant but unmistakable thump of helicopter rotors, growing rapidly closer. The drone feed, still miraculously active, showed new shapes dropping from the night sky, fast roping figures in advance kit, moving with lethal purpose. The tide turned moments. The enemy muzzle flashes that had been pinning down Talon Actual's team began to wink out, one by one, under precise and overwhelming fire from the new arrivals. The PMC forces, prepared for a trapped CIA team, were utterly unprepared for a full JSOC takedown. The battle became a rout. A new voice, raspy and breathless, came over the team's frequency. It was Talon Actual. Watchtower. Viking is here. By God, they're here. We are secure. The package is secure. She's alive. The relief that washed over Chloe was so profound her knees buckled. She sank into her chair. Tears she didn't know she was holding back finally streaming down her face. She had done it. She had pulled them back from the edge. Weeks later, the summons came. She stood at attention in her dress blues in a nondescript government office. A Navy admiral and a severe-looking woman in a CIA pinstriped suit stood before her. There was no audience, no ceremony. The admiral held a simple, black velvet box. He opened it. Inside, on a field of blue velvet, lay the CIA's Distinguished Intelligence Cross. For extraordinary heroism and intrepidity at the grave risk of your life, the admiral said, his voice quiet but firm. This will never be public record, but we will know what you did. He closed the box and handed it to her. The woman from the CIA simply nodded, a look of deep respect in her eyes. The community owes you a debt, petty officer. They left her alone then. She stood holding the box, not as a piece of metal, but as an absolution. The ghosts were quiet. The debt was paid.